this is the next generation of U.S. GHG markets, and I'm at Herrick, as Tom said. I'm the SVP of Public Affairs and Communications at IDFA. I'm also the Executive Director of our foundation and one of our co-leads for our sustainability work at IDFA. And in this session, we're looking at the emergence of a supply chain within a supply chain. With carbon markets and renewable energy, a new supply chain is emerging in agriculture that is delivering new streams of revenue for producers and providing new tools to processors and other actors to offset their GHG. And the question we have then is, how do we capitalize on these opportunities? How do we remove obstacles? And how do we accelerate these tools and technologies for the future? And I'm pleased here to have 4 amazingly accomplished guests today who represent different pieces of this new supply chain. Paul Myer is CEO of Athian. Chris Malone is head of emerging opportunities with Indigo Ag. Steve Shehadey is owner of Bar 20 Dairy in California and winner of multiple sustainability awards in dairy farming. And Beth Robertson-Martin is co-founder and vice president and partner of partner development for Merge Impact. We're going to have a discussion. Feel free to ask questions. Use your app to text in questions. I'd love to see questions coming in as we're having the conversation, and we'll refer to those questions as much as we can. And if we have some opportunity at the end and some additional time, we'll sit down and we'll try to take some more questions from you all. All right, let's get started. I'm going to direct questions to our panelists, and like I said, if you have any to text in, please do. Paul, I'll start with you. Let's look at the business case for GHG reduction. And in the fall, IDFA and McKinsey and Company worked together to survey our, almost 400 members on their sustainability and ESG journeys. And primarily, we wanted to know, do you have a sustainability strategy? And we were pleasantly surprised to learn that 2/3 of our members did indeed, and they're mostly focused on GHG reduction and sustainability and packaging. So for businesses in dairy, what is the business case that we need to make to our boards, our investors, customers, or stakeholders for investing in solutions to reduce GHG emissions and carbon, and why is it essential from a business perspective? Paul, start with you.
Well, I think there's a lot of constituencies that care about the overall climate and the trends that we see towards climate warming. And those discussions are really being driven by investors and stakeholders, even on an international basis. And so I think we have to be aware of those pressures that I think are behind the industry, and we need to own that narrative. And I think as farmers and producers, we take seriously our responsibility to the animals that we work with and to the environment in general. And I don't think the industry always gets credit for the work that we do. And I think from a business perspective, we need to shift that discussion. And I think that's why farmers, on the one hand, they're skeptical of some of the requirements that and the commitments that they're being asked to make.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they're doing a lot of the right things on farm, but they're not getting credit for it. And I think that it gives them the opportunity to really change that discussion. And ultimately, the consumers, if you look at the research, the consumers are really driving a lot of this conversation. As you get to successively younger and younger generations, they've already articulated a desire to purchase products from companies that are aware of their greenhouse gas footprint, and then in most cases they're willing to pay more for those products.
Right.
So I think it's our responsibility as an industry to pay attention to that, because it's gonna eventually translate to the bottom line.
And how does Athian help?
So Athian was really designed to solve the problem of how do we monetize and fund these greenhouse gas interventions at scale for producers. I think historically the industry has focused on products like feed additives to increase efficiency and increase production. But there's a whole raft of new products now coming to market that impact greenhouse gas footprint, but don't have any kind of efficiency claim. And so if farmers are expected to utilize these feed additives in their operations. If they don't have a way to pay for them, they're never going to be widely adopted. So what Athian is doing is we're essentially automating the entire process of validating, certifying, and building out protocols for greenhouse gas reductions on farm, and then providing the mechanism to automate the carbon credit accounting, the marketing of those credits, and then funneling revenue back to the producer to fund those interventions. So we're designed to essentially connect each step in the value chain to provide a holistic way to mint carbon insetting credits and provide a new revenue source back to the producer.
Amazing. And Steve, your farm, you've been farming for a long time, part of a dairy farm family for a long time, generations now. Your family's been farming. How did, and you've been awarded you've been recognized many times around sustainability work. Did someone come to you at some point in time and make the business case around sustainability and GHG reductions? Or is that a business decision that you made for your operation? And how did that evolve?
Well, we've been in the Central Valley of California. My grandfather moved to the Fresno area in 1950. I'm third generation, and so our families lived and grown up in that area. And so we care about our community, we care about our land, we care about our employees, and I've always been intrigued by digesters. It's a simple concept that you can take manure, reduce methane, and create a clean, renewable energy, right? Which in California, better air, more power, more energy, those are two challenges that we face. So, but somebody once told me, it's hard to be green when you're in the red. And so up until a few years ago, it wasn't economically viable to do digesters. Back in 2007, 2008, when we first started looking at them, I think the utility company would give you about 10 cents a kilowatt, and it would cost you about 18 to 20 to run your digester. So there was, I think, 20 plus digesters that were just sitting there, as mothballed because it wasn't viable to run them. So these kind of incentives help make it more economical to do it. And on a dairy, there's only three ways to generate income. It's your milk, which goes up and down. There's times where you're milking your cows and losing money, but you can't turn off a cow. You got to keep feeding them. You got to take care of them. And then there's your beef side, and then there's the manure. So the exciting thing is just seeing all the technology and the developments on that side. And I think the future is very exciting.
Yeah. And manure has really become sort of a cash crop in itself, right, in the last decade or so, right?
It's getting there, yeah.
It's getting there.
The credits are making that more viable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's been a lot of talk about data at this conference. I think each one of the sessions so far is really focused on data, and I'd like to ask a question about data here to Beth and Chris. And so every time we talk to processors, we have a conversation with our processor members about GHG reductions. They point to data, and they point to reliability of data, the issues and the expense of gathering data, ensuring that the data is reliable, third-party verification, and then reporting the data. And I understand data is more integrated today in end-to-end solutions than it was even just a few years ago, but talk about the opportunities that exist today for making it easier on farmers and food processors to gather and report reliable GHG data. And I'll start with you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. So I think when people think about carbon assets, conjuring images of project developers and verifiers and registries and lots of paperwork and manual processes, and that has traditionally been true. In the last, maybe 5 years, we've seen a big influx of venture money into technology companies to take a different approach at generating carbon assets, and Indigo is one of those companies. And so in our industry, which is row crop agriculture and producing carbon assets, both from removals of CO2 into the soil and from abated emissions through agricultural production, we are a fully tech-led approach so that we don't have those same types of manual processes. So, for example, we've acquired companies that help us with remote sensing to be able to understand which practices are happening from satellite imagery. We've done integrations with existing data on farms. We acquired Soil Metrics, but had the leading biogeochemical model for soils so that we don't have to soil sample every year to figure out how much carbon is in the ground. We can model it. And today we have a full stack. We've spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars building and acquiring this stack that can run the process from bringing an offer to a farmer to generating a carbon asset, all through technology, all fully scalably. And it has made agricultural carbon programs honestly possible. And so for us, that has been a big game changer. You're seeing this happen in other areas, such as in forestry, where similar approaches are being taken to use data and technology and basically move away from previous very paper-based and manual systems.
Who likes doing their taxes? So I think of data collection at the farm level much like I do my taxes, right? It's a lot of paperwork. Someone takes some money at some point, and I know sort of theoretically that I get something in return, but I don't really see it. So I think it sounds like we have similar points of view on this, but at Merge Impact, we think that data collection should be free and of zero work to the farmer, and that the data belongs to the farmer when it's all said and done, which is why we exist, is to make this process easier. I just read this week that a gaming company in Hong Kong, I believe, installed an AI CEO at their flagship location. And so I just think if they can do that, we can automate this process. So I think it sounds like everyone up here is working towards those solutions, but again, it's free, it's of zero work or low friction, and the data belongs to the farmer when it's all said and done.
Paul, what do you think about that statement?
Yeah, you're right. The reality is, and I think the presentation from BCG this morning articulated the fact that the only way to solve a lot of these thorny digital problems in our category is you've got to be able to get those silos of data to communicate one with another. And carbon credits and ESG in general requires each step in the process to be part of the solution. And so a data silo doesn't really do any individual much good unless it's communicating with the other silos. So if we can leverage technology to connect those dots, that's great. More importantly, you need some kind of incentive for each member of the value chain to play. And ultimately, that incentive has to make its way back to the producer because, let's face it, for greenhouse gas reductions, 90% of the footprint comes from the producer. A lot of the people at the end of the value chain have made commitments around their greenhouse gas footprint and reducing it, and they need access to that data. But without a clear way to compensate the entire supply chain, it's not going to get solved. So the farmer is the only one that hasn't made those long-term commitments, and they're the place where we need the most work to be done. So we need to get that back to the producer.
Steve, I'm curious about your impressions of the,
Yeah, I think it's important to be able to track the data because, like we've heard before, the dairy and the farmers have been doing a lot of these things just as in their day-to-day operations, being sustainable, but unless we can track it and verify it and get the message out to the consumers, then that's what they want to see.
Do you have help? Do you have partners? Do you have folks that you work with in order to be able to gather that data?
We do. As far as the digester goes, we partnered with a company called California Bioenergy, which is a digester developer, and they've got about 40 operating in California at this time and another 60 under development. So I know what I know. I know the dairy farm. I know the cows. I know the business side of the dairy, but I don't know much about digesters and methane, and that's their specialty. They've been doing it. And when you go into a project, it's a commitment. You look for partners that you're going to be with, being able to trust and do business with for the next 20 years. And so we went through 2 or 3 different companies before we were able to come up with them, but they've been helpful, and we work together as a team. And they monitor through telemetry the production of the digester, and Bloom Energy, which handles the fuel cell. They're monitoring it constantly 24 hours a day, and if there's challenges or problems, then again, it comes down to people, and we're on site and we work with them and do what they tell us to do. But yeah, it's all about team, and it's all about good people.
Yeah, And I've heard, we've talked a little bit about insets and offsets here already, and there's a healthy debate, I think, shaping up in the industry, in the dairy industry in particular, about the value of each. And I'm just curious from your points of view, Paul and Beth, what is the value of the inset versus the offset to a producer and to a food company? And then what efforts exist today to maintain the value of GHG reductions within a specific supply chain such as dairy? And what needs to change to make it easier to maintain that value? Paul, I'll start with you because I know you're really in the thick of this.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we've heard a lot about dairy digesters today, and it's a great example because it illustrates the fact that when somebody pays for something, action speaks louder than words. And it's a little bit of a cautionary tale because a lot of that initial funding came from energy companies purchasing either the renewable natural gas or buying the credits as offsets. And when that happens, they get to take credit for it against their inventory, but the industry as a whole does not. So offsets don't really help the dairy industry. It helps the farmer, and I think rightly so, because those are capital-intensive projects, and these companies put up the dollars to get that done. I think, especially over the last two, COP26 and COP27, these international conferences around climate change essentially have articulated the fact that you can no longer buy an offset in order to reach your science-based targets if you have the ability to make change within your own supply chain. So we think over the long term, today, offsets are in some ways more valuable than insets, but there's not a healthy market for insets yet. But that over time, if you're General Mills, you're going to have to buy insets. You can't just pay a farmer in the Amazon not to cut down their trees anymore.
Yeah.
I think about offsets like that one as, so I imagine I go to get my haircut and I sit down in the chair and my stylist says, I want you to pay me so I don't shave your head. And I just cannot stress how much no one wants this, and consumers do not believe in this model. So I think the closer we get to approaching carbon like a crop or another type of asset, the easier this is going to get. So thinking, look, we have to have, we get inventory of this. We have generally accepted accounting principles. We approach it the same way we do everything else in terms of a financial P&L and your inventory, so that you avoid double counting, you avoid the greenwashing that's happening, or even just within your own organization, you're trying to do what's right, and yet you have little to no visibility to what it is your money is going towards. So I think for us, we truly believe that if you start approaching carbon and insetting, like you would a crop inventory, that you're going to be able to get really close to having the value where it's supposed to be, and it gets a lot easier for the farmers to manage.
Yeah, I agree, and we'll often use the analogy of calorie counts on foods, which is something that we all assume today but didn't exist in the past. And if you can see the bags that say only 100 calorie snack. It doesn't have to say in some hypothetical scenario, if you hadn't bought the snack, you would have had this many calories, therefore your calorie impact is X, where there's all sorts of problems of like, well, how do they know? It just says it's a 100 calorie snack. You know if that's a good number. And that's where insetting or really inventories are very valuable. If we can produce products and say, here's its carbon footprint, you can decide how much you value that. And I think it sends a really nice signal back to farmers too, if you can tell them, hey, each CI point reduction in your crop is worth more, because it can go into these certain types of products. And that's really what we're hoping to set up in Scope 3.
Who pays for insetting? I mean, who pays the premium? Who pays for the practices? Well, I think that's a challenge right now. I think that we're trying to manage, because on the offsets, they leave the value chain essentially, and someone buys that, and there's a value ascribed to it, and then that becomes the revenue that you then plow back into your operation. On the inset side, who pays?
Well, everyone can is the great thing about it, because that's a shared, your Scope 3 footprint is shared with a lot of other people. And so if you have a product and it maybe flows through a processor and then to a food company and then to a retailer, they may all actually care to see improvements. There's no double counting. They're all counting in the same improvement because it's in all of their Scope 3 emissions. So And that's part of the reason we're seeing, I think, higher prices in Scope 3 is, one, you have fewer options, but two, you can share some of that value with other parts of the supply chain.
At Merge, we believe that if you are a food company and you want to claim carbon in your emissions reduction, then you have to pay for it. If you don't pay for it, it's not yours. I mean, end of story.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's actually a really interesting debate inside the industry because there's a free rider problem when you talk about insets. And it's, I think, and I won't name names necessarily, but there are some retailers that will send out a survey and they'll ask you, tell us all the great things you're doing around sustainability so we can take credit against that, our greenhouse gas footprint. The Sustain Cert, I think, is really leading the way from a policy perspective on this with their value change initiative. And it's specifically designed to enable the industry to essentially, we call it nesting and co-claiming, but sharing credits throughout the value chain. And essentially what that means is if the producer is making an investment on farm and it results in a 30% reduction in their greenhouse gas footprint, then they can monetize that in a carbon inset credit, and the processor, so the dairy co-op, can share in that at 100%, as long as they pitch in to help pay for it. And then the consumer packaged goods company or processor can also share in that by pitching in at 100%. And then a retailer or a food service provider can also pitch in and take advantage of that. And then a retailer. And if you look at it compared to an offset market is a discrete store of value that gets sold one time and that's it. In an inset model, the entire industry can take credit for it, and you can essentially, according to the greenhouse gas protocol, it's a double and triple counting of the same reduction. But because you're able to track it, and ultimately that's why you have to automate the process. If you want to be able to effectively share costs among each step in the value chain, you have to make that a reasonable value proposition. And ultimately that's how you make that inset more valuable to the producer, because you've got 4 or 5 steps all helping to fund that rather than one single player. And that's kind of how it works today. Nestle is going to go pay for a specific intervention, and then you got a lot of free riders in the process.
That's right.
And that's interesting because we have a related question here from the audience. If consumers, if the consumer's push is going to drive the ESG change, then how do we distribute the margin from the CPG brands to the producers to pay for the change, right? And so what we're saying up here, I think, is it isn't just the producer, right? It's a cost that's essentially spread out throughout the supply chain. Steve, I'm just curious your thoughts there. I mean, the question is, Steve, why don't you pay for it?
I think, we're all a team. I think it's from the producers to the retailers to the industry to the processors to our industry partners. We're all in this together, right? I mean, we all need each other, and so I think we need to work together as far as sharing some of these costs, because producers are limited on what they can afford. I mean, most of your value is sitting in cows and real estate and feed, right? I mean, You have a line that you operate on, and when you have a good year, you pay it down, and then when you have a bad year, you draw back down on it. So it's hard, and not knowing what your milk price is going to be next month or 2 months from now or 6 months from now, you got to be conservative. And we all have dealt with banks, and they're very conservative on these type of things because a lot of it's new, and banks like to look backwards and see what's proven versus what is moving forward. So.
Yeah. Well, we've talked a little bit about dairy digesters here, and I'd love to sort of dig into that a little bit more. Primarily in the past, the main financer of those projects had been the Department of Agriculture, had grant programs, the REAP program, some other programs, or it was up to the farmer essentially to finance. That's been changing, in the last 10 or 20 years, especially with the maturation of the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, the regulatory scheme there in California. Other states are thinking about developing similar policies, and the marketplace continues to grow. It's become more privatized, it's become more professionalized. So I wanted to talk about what each party really brings to that partnership related to the digester. And Steve, I'll start with you. What must the producer bring to that renewable energy partnership, and what do the infrastructure or the energy companies bring? And then how well do these teams work together? And what do they each get out of it, respectively? And then Paul, I'll turn to you.
Okay, in our case, we've got several partners, and without any one of them, we might not have a project today. It started out with, there's federal programs, there's tax credits. There was a 30% federal income tax credit, and with the state of California, the Department of Ag offers incentives, grants for these type of projects, and again, the banks, right? And so if you can show some incentive and through tax credits and through real life numbers. Now, our other partners are utility company because we produce energy that goes into the grid. And so, you know, our return was based a lot on how much money we were going to save on our utilities, right? When the milk prices are down, we're going to consistently depend on that savings on the energy side. And we know energy is not going to go down in price, especially in California. So, and then our partners at Bloom Energy, which understand the fuel cells, and Cal Bio, which understands how they've helped us get the grant, go through the grant process, and to you know, monetize the reductions in methane.
And how long is that agreement for the digester?
20 years.
20 years.
20 years, yep.
So that's a commitment. That's a significant.
It's a big commitment, yeah. But if you're going to be in the dairy business, I think, you know, it's not about milking more cows. It's about doing more with less. You know, less water, less cows, more efficiency. I mean, there was 25 million cows in 1950, and again, 9 million today. So the industry's done a great job through technology, through genetics, through nutrition, through animal welfare. All these type of things have helped, and now reducing our footprint is another step.
Has LCFS, I mean, LCFS has been a driver, I would imagine, in California for the maturation of this marketplace. Would you agree?
It's really helped. Now, there's some challenges because, you know, it used to be you just get so much from PG&E, which is the utility, but now with LCFS, now the problem we faced is our digester became operational in October of 2021, and we're still going through the process because CARB is so backed up with projects and they don't move very fast. And so we've been 18 months now and haven't received a penny from the LCFS credit. So, and then the price has gone up and down. When we first modeled it, it was $180 to $200 a unit. Now it's, I think, 60 because of things the oil company got into renewable diesel and things like that. So that it's kind of a moving target, but you know, for us, it was one of the main factors to do the project, along with savings in electricity and producing clean energy, which we produce more energy on the dairy than what we use. So.
Yeah. Paul, what are your thoughts? I mean, I'm curious about the partnership piece of this and what it each brings to the equation.
So I think there's two things related to this challenge, and the first one is the digester, full-blown digesters are incredibly capital intensive, and I think the way you described it is exactly the way that it gets implemented in the marketplace. Is it requires a significant amount of capital. It could be government grants, it could be financial incentives, and it requires a 20-year commitment because you've got to pay all those investors back. Part of the challenge that drives that is LCFS in general, because it combines the value as a renewable fuel to essentially a carbon credit without calling it a carbon credit. So until they separate those two, it's difficult to really carve out the value of the offset itself, as opposed to its value as part of the fuel. So that's the first challenge, is that it's capital intensive and it doesn't accurately apportion the value to the carbon offset itself. The second one is that if you're not a large organization, I mean, there aren't very many operations that could sustain a project of that size and of that expense over a long period of time without getting paid for it.
Yeah.
So we fundamentally believe that anything you do to cut your greenhouse gas footprint needs to be available to all size producers. And so there's a lot of things you can do short of a full-blown digester that we can already today, as long as you can quantify it, we can monetize it. We can carve out that value as a carbon inset and get you paid for it pretty much right away without investing all the dollars for a full-blown digester. I mean, I think it definitely makes sense, and we'd love to see the industry get there, but we've got to find alternative ways of apportioning the value of that and getting that back to the producer.
Just one other comment. Yeah, in our case, we invested the financial investment for the project, but a lot of the dairies now, what they're doing is they don't want to put in anything because, again, they want to worry about their cows, but these developers will come in and they'll pay them $50 or $100 per animal for the manure and stuff. And so it takes the financial risk off the dairies, but then again, the developers will keep all the credits, and they're the ones that do pretty good. So.
Yeah. Well, that's an example of a regulatory compliance market. There are the voluntary markets in the carbon space as well. And I'm curious, Chris, how have the compliance and voluntary markets, changed the conversation about ag's role in GHG mitigation and removal? And as these markets mature, where are the growth opportunities? And also, where are the persistent pain points?
The compliance markets are, let's call it an opportunity, not a challenge. And it's a massive opportunity for us in row crop agriculture where we are. If you look at a lot of the fuels going into these programs, corn ethanol, soy-based renewable diesel, for example, the majority of the carbon footprint of those fuels are actually from the feedstock, the corn or the soybeans. And to date, despite the programs being very math and data driven and very specific about every actual CI, they ignored that part. So you could have the highest carbon footprint, worst grown corn in America, or the best, and it's going to be treated with the same number. And so we're pushing really hard to say, well, let's move to a dynamic number. Let's let farmers who want to bring their own number and meet certain standards to be able to do that. And if that is something others in the room are working on as well, I'd love to talk to you at lunch. And so that's really been our position with the compliance programs. And I think we're going to get some of that. I know Treasury is working on the rules for the 45Z, which values carbon at close to $200 a ton, which is great. And we're hoping the agriculture ends up in that. Canada, for their new program, has said they want to bring in agriculture. It's in the rules. Brazil's already doing it. So it's starting to happen, just not yet in California. And then on the voluntary side, well, look, both of these markets, the price of carbon has gone up a lot generally in the last couple of years. So I think old people selling offsets in voluntary markets are used to selling them for a couple bucks, and now some really high-end programs are selling well over $100. And similarly in the compliance programs, yes, California's come down a little bit this year, but generally, these programs are around $20, whether you be in Europe or the United States. Now they're generally in the hundreds. In British Columbia, $400 or $500 Canadian for a ton of carbon. So that's helping kind of lift all markets.
And we're starting to see payments too, right? Indigo paid, I think, $3-4 million out to farmers last year. I know Truterra yesterday announced some payments, $6 million or so. So does that help in your conversations when your field people are out talking to farmers?
Yeah, the voluntary carbon markets grow at triple-digit numbers year over year, starting from a small spot. So yeah, it's at this point we're getting bigger markets and better understanding of pricing, at least in offsets. And farmers see the money, and then insetting, as we've been talking about, or inventories really. Farmers react well to that because while the price isn't as transparent and it's newer, they're seeing more money. They're seeing standards there that maybe are more fair. If someone is already a very good farmer, that doesn't hurt them, it helps them. So we're seeing we're growing very quickly in the insetting area, which is now larger than the offsetting area for us.
Right. Beth, I'm curious your thoughts on this. A believer in the voluntary carbon markets?
I think it's allowed us to make a ton of progress, and get to where we are today. I think, until there's some level of requirement, it's a hobby for a lot of people, and I think what we need is a little more alignment and regulation around what the accounting is and how you.
A global standard or domestic? You mean SEC? Or we're talking about?
I think a domestic row crop standard from my perspective, which is where we kind of live in this space. But I do think global accounting standards are going to help us tremendously as we think about the Paris Agreement.
Right. Do you have thoughts on that, Paul? The need for rigor, at least in the global standards?
Yeah, so I think we should draw a distinction between regulation in terms of what governments are asking farmers to do versus, I think what you're referring to is greater consistency in greenhouse gas accounting standards.
Yes. That's correct.
Yeah, I think that fundamentally North America doesn't respond well to overarching regulation from the government, but that really is our opportunity in a voluntary market, is to make the changes required so that we're meeting these obligations. We are certainly seeing significant demand from companies that are internationally based, that are being regulated and required to report their footprints. So they are driving conversation, but it's in the context of North America, it's a voluntary market. And I think that allows us to have a much more robust answer to that. And ultimately, I think we know as an industry what's best for our operations. And as long as there's sufficient capital to make those changes, we're going to do a much more effective job than the government could.
I think when we get into, sort of thinking about U.S. or North America-based versus global, it is a lot about investment, right? There's a lot of requirements around global investment that have to adhere to European standards that impact us here. So I think at least aligning or understanding as much as possible how that could impact is important, because it's not just about, we know what's best in terms of management here, but in terms of global accountability, it's there has to be some level of alignment in order for us to take advantage of global money.
For sure. If you have questions, please text them in. We have one here. Does the panel believe the demand for voluntary? Oh, I don't know what happened there. This question just disappeared. There we go.
I think the question was.
I didn't capture it.
Yeah, if there's if general economic uncertainty is going to impact.
I see. Yeah.
The voluntary markets.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on economic uncertainty impacting voluntary markets?
We haven't seen a lot of that, honestly. It's carbon prices have been pretty stable relative to about every other commodity. So I think that's because it's still so new and relatively so small. But the only area where we've seen some impact of that is companies perhaps procuring fewer raw materials because they're reducing their own production. Therefore, you have a smaller thing you need to kind of drive down the carbon footprint of. But for most of them, they're at subscale anyway, so that's not really moving the number at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that what we have seen is premium brands that position themselves as, carbon neutral. I think that's the only real example that we've seen so far, that in times of economic uncertainty, consumers shift to lower cost brands. So we have definitely seen that trend. But I think you're right, you hit the nail on the head that there's a lot of pent-up demand for sustainability in general. And so in some ways, the voluntary markets are still insulated from the direct consumer response that is indicated by an economic downturn. But I think over the long term, it'll become more of an impact. But today, I don't think it does impact us much.
And you mentioned marketing claims. That's interesting. I mean, we've talked about this emerging challenges of use claims a bit, and in companies like Christy, I think you had mentioned North Face. We talked about Ralph Lauren. They've got a sustainable cotton program. They're partnering with growers to be able to claim that their products are low carbon or are responsible for specific GHG reductions. And from my perspective and work with food companies, I see the marketing claims as certainly as a great opportunity to differentiate ourselves in dairy. And I'm curious how businesses in this room can be better prepared to leverage marketing claims and also to avoid pitfalls. Beth, I'll start with you on that.
There's just enormous value in getting this right and enormous risk in, kind of getting it wrong as well or making claims that aren't verified. I think it was McKinsey and Nielsen who just released a study that they looked at 600,000 food SKUs over the last 6 years, and those with ESG strategies outperformed by 40%. And now maybe you can't claim causation, but I certainly think that there's interesting data points there. So to me, it is a clear benefit to market what you're doing. And this is one of the reasons why Emerge Impact actually came to be, is that after my 15 years in the food industry, just seeing brands making claims a lot of times they weren't true, not because of malice, but because these things are hard to do. So, being able to help measure, track, and tell the story behind how brands are doing great work. And so I think, yes, there is definitely benefit in getting this right. Although, getting it wrong can be a problem too. I think there's a lot of companies right now who are seeing the changes in how we view offsets as a real problem. And so even just today, I think Gucci removed their net zero claim because the majority of it is coming from offsets. And so I think that there's always, negative news can happen too when you put yourself out there.
Yeah. And Chris, I think you raised this when we had a conversation a few weeks back.
Yeah.
I'm curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, we're very interested in understanding any consumer value downstream, because even a small amount of money paid there is very amplified when it goes all the way back in the supply chain. It's often pennies on the dollar of the cost of raw materials to the final price. And so we have 2 projects that you can see in stores right now. One is with Post Holdings. So they launched a brand called Airly, which will be a whole suite of products. Right now it's just crackers. And it just went national in Walmart. We'll actually have an end-cap display in Walmart stores starting on the 20th. And on the box, kind of as I was talking about the 100 calories, it says on the box how many grams of carbon are in the box. And it's mostly oats and wheat in the cracker. And so we've gotten like the best performing growers in America to produce this for them, where they actually have negative footprints because they sequester so much carbon in their soil and they're very efficient in their practices. And so the box actually tells you how many grams of carbon came out of the atmosphere in the production of that box. So this is a very new thing where we're going to start to see the consumer response. And then similarly with the North Face, they have a product line now called Climate Conscious Clothing. And the cotton that's going into that is coming from us. So we're getting them cotton from growers who are using regenerative practices. We're not yet quantifying that full footprint for them, but they're doing more of a kind of generic claim around the cotton being regenerative based on how it was grown. And you'd asked about how do you kind of think about making those claims. Both sides had a good amount of legal engagement in it as they're making any type of product claim. I think that absolute claim versus the relative one is much safer. So in neither are we saying, look, you bought this, therefore, if you didn't, you would have bought that, and therefore you saved carbon, or anything very complicated like that. We're just quantifying what is in the box or qualifying it and making that claim on the box. And that seems to be a much easier thing to convince consumers of, and to not get yourself in trouble with, like we're seeing in a lot of the offset programs right now, particularly around forestry. People are questioning some of these baselines that were used. We wouldn't have that type of problem because we don't have a counterfactual we're trying to compare it to.
Steve, I'm curious from your perspective, what do you think about this conversation related to marketing claims? Is anything good if it's good for the farmer? If we can put a claim on a gable top?
Yeah, in our case, our family also bottles milk and sells fluid milk throughout California under Producers Dairy, and so we sell milk to Costco and to the Walmarts and stuff. And so we have standards. Costco and Walmart are two that listen to their customers, and things like animal welfare audits and environmental sustainability are key to them. It just differentiates us from somebody else. But I guess it ultimately is going to be driven by the consumer, right?
There are definitely some regulatory and some financial hurdles that we still need to overcome here for GHG credits and markets, I think, to really pop for producers and investors, and certainly for society at large. And we talked a little about low carbon fuel standard. That's under threat now. The governor of California has ordered essentially a rulemaking process to potentially rescope the low carbon fuel standard, which might cap credits, might end some of those credits related to digesters, which would be a huge blow, certainly for our industry and animal agriculture, and especially set a bad precedent for some of the other states like New York, looking to set up similar regulatory schemes. Paul, I'll start with you. I'm just curious from your standpoint, what are some of those regulatory, financial, or business hurdles you see now that we can work together as an industry to help overcome?
So it's a good question, and I'm thinking back to last night's presentation. I think it was Michael that pointed out the Oatly ad that had the, essentially the blank page on the other side, asking the dairy industry to respond. And I think from a 30,000-foot view, the dairy industry needs to respond with data and with our position as it relates to sustainability, right? We need to own that narrative, and we can't do it with just a product claim necessarily. Like, we need to do it as an industry as a whole. And the only way we're going to get there is if we can accurately pull data from each of those silos and be able to present it to the industry in a way that is transparent, validated, certified, and beyond reproach. If we can do that, if we can accomplish that, then we'll move the market, right? We'll be able to respond to that consumer demand in a way that is above reproach.
Yeah, and I know there are people in this room that are out gathering that data. As we speak, that we're working on teams that are out there doing it. And I think we as an industry are probably on the cusp, like literally on the cusp of being able to publicize, to report that data. And as an industry in food and beverage and in agriculture generally, we're probably years ahead of many other parts of food and agriculture, and how we gather data, the reliability of that data, just from my experience. And I'm curious other folks' thoughts on some of these regulatory, financial, social challenges that we face here around GHG. Chris?
Well, so if CARB or others put a cap, I guess even and that did happen, still a very large market going in even within that cap. And there's still a lot of improvement to be made. So we don't necessarily see that as game over. That said, if you're trying to create an objective system, which I think they have, which is probably why it's been so successful, there aren't a lot of carbon programs in the world that have actually beat their goals. That's why their prices are going down. It's because they're ahead of schedule. And they did that because they were very objective. The best CI wins. So if you start to bring in subjectivity into that with caps, I agree, it kind of can hurt the message you're sending, and really the system that spurred innovation and let the California greatly reduce its footprint from transportation.
Steve?
I'd just like to say, I think a big part of it is educating and telling the story of dairy. In California, we've got a group called Dairy Cares, which has been around, and it's a group of processors and a group of dairy farms, and they're telling the sustainability story. They're involved in the politics of Sacramento because our adversaries, the environmental groups and animal rights groups that don't want dairy, are very unified, and they've got a lot of money. And so when I first joined the group 15 years ago, it was all about lawsuits and this guy's getting sued, and this guy's getting sued and all that. Now it's proactive, looking at research and verifying facts, working with UC Davis, doing studies on air quality and water quality, and what are the next challenges, being proactive and stuff. And so we've had CARB come out to our dairy resource board, did a tour, saw the fuel cell, saw the digester, and so that they are educated, so when the other side tries to tell their story, they've got some information. In fact, one of them drove their Tesla out to the facility, and they didn't have enough energy to leave, so we had to charge them with our cow power and get them home.
Is that a real story?
It's a real story.
I love that.
It's a real good story.
That's great. Beth, you have thoughts about some of the challenges, the obstacles, and how we can work together as an industry to overcome some of those?
Yeah, I think about the almond board and the success they had with marketing, almonds. So as a coalition industry, an industry group, they really pushed sort of the health benefits of almonds as a group, and now we all think of almonds as the healthiest nut. I remember at General Mills, we bought equal amounts of almonds and peanuts and cashew, all of it. And I was on a tour, the peanut tour in the southeast, and they were, those peanut guys were just pissed because they were like, the nutrient content of peanuts is largely the same. Like, they just did better marketing.
Yeah.
And I think that we, as someone who comes from branded food companies and whose husband is a marketer, I think that there's just a tremendous amount of value in kind of the collaborative approach, the cross-industry approach that, a group like IDFA would take, to tell the collective positive story that comes from this industry.
Yeah, and I think it's a good segue into this last set of questions around partnerships, and then we definitely can't do this alone, as everyone up here has testified to. We need partnerships, certainly across public, private, and the philanthropic sectors. And I'm curious, Steve, you mentioned a bunch of partnerships that you're engaged in, and Paul, from your perspective, what are some of those game-changing partnerships you see potentially emerging that could help dairy meet its 2050 goal?
Well, look, I think we've seen leadership from a variety of players in the supply chain, from animal health companies to, on the beef side, packers and processors, the dairy co-ops, and certainly organizations like this one. We've seen positive moves from each of those players, and they're putting their money where their mouth is. And those investments, I think it's our job as an industry to make sure that we get those dollars back to the producer.
Yeah.
Because ultimately that's where all the change needs to take place, and in a lot of ways producers don't really control the prices they get for their products. You can do some degree of self-marketing and distribution, but we need to be able to defray those costs for the producer in an efficient way that matches the way they run their business. If we can ensure that we're able to properly fund that, then we're going to be able to solve the problem.
Yeah. Chris, I'm curious from your perspective, any partnerships out there that you're really excited about? Potential partnerships or partnerships that we need?
Yeah, so it came up a little bit earlier, but I think what the WWF is doing with the Science-Based Target Initiatives, they recently released flag guidance, well, not recently, about a year ago, which finally you can make targets around land use and land change and use that in your Scope 3 accounting, so that's great. And primarily WRI is working on the land sector removals guidance as part of the greenhouse gas protocol, which would then tell you, okay, what can you do to go then make those improvements? So right now, for us, that's a very big area, and we work very closely with those NGOs to help guide them on kind of what is possible and not possible. I think the knee-jerk response they get from most people in the industry is like, let's water it down as much as we can.
Yeah.
And so, us being a technology company kind of says the opposite. We say, well, actually our tech can do X and Y and Z. It is possible. You could maybe be firm here and there, knowing that, it is possible. It's just new.
Steve, do you see the retailer as a partner here, or are they just kind of telling you what to do?
I see everybody as a partner. The retailer, the processors, the industry, and our suppliers. We all need each other to be successful. And telling the story, and we've got a lot of data on the dairies. The cows, the genetics, and all this stuff. And talking about technology and some of the exciting informational technologies that are available. It's getting together and using some of that information to tell the story. Like, again, 25 million cows down to 9.
Right.
38% of what it was, producing 70% more milk. You tell people that, and everything you hear from the media is these cows are causing global warming, right? And it's cutting to a third.
Yeah, and you've mentioned UC Davis. They're a great partner. Dairy Care's Environmental Defense Fund, EDF. They were sort of on the opposite end of this, 10, 20 years ago. They're a partner with the dairy industry now. Beth, you've been working in the sourcing space for a long time, so you're well aware of the value, the need for partnerships. What partnerships do you think that this industry might need to build that we don't currently have, or what partnerships excite you?
I am excited about a lot of the partnerships that I've seen in the Climate Smart Ag, program. Some of the coalitions that have formed in order to address, the Climate Smart grants, the USDA funded programs.
I think $4 or $5 billion worth of programming.
Yeah, and I think
billion.
Yeah, billions. I think that the public-private partnerships that have developed out of that, having been at General Mills for a long time, working on various aspects of regenerative or sustainable sourcing. The public-private partnership model has always been successful in my mind. General Mills was the first and largest commitment to pollinator health globally, with a partnership with Xerces and the NRCS, which in fact is going to end up helping their GHG commitment quite a bit I heard a statistic the other day from Xerces actually that if you planted hedgerows just 3 feet across and however many miles you've got access to on your farm, if you planted hedgerows on all of the agricultural land in California, it sequesters about 2.2 pounds of carbon per square meter, and you could address about 12% of the California carbon reduction goal just with hedgerows. So I think that thinking outside the box in terms of it's not just about carbon removal, it's about nature-based solutions, that there are conservation organizations that can help, as well as NGOs that have been working on this for a long time and maybe not directly measuring emissions or carbon reduction, but who have solutions that can help across the board. So I think that there's just been a lot of creative ways of looking at how to improve everything across the supply chain from a biodiversity and a carbon standpoint.
Yeah. If you have any final questions, now's a good time to text them in. We've got about 5 minutes left. And I'll ask one final question here before we see if the audience has any. And it's about, we've talked about partnerships. Everybody up here represents, they're part of an innovative space. They work for an innovator. They're a pioneer, as Tom had said earlier, So I'm curious, what are the innovations on the horizon that you're excited about that are going to help us meet our 2050 goals? So Chris, I'll start with you. What's out there? What's coming next?
Once you create a market for something, there's new demand to make money from it, and that's just starting to happen. And so, in the area where we play, it's very focused on sequestering carbon into the soil as a removal from the atmosphere. And no one was really intentionally trying to do that before. And so we're seeing a lot of new companies getting funded to help do that at a much greater rate. These are things like microbes that fix carbon and mineralize carbon, so it's permanently stored down there. They're genetics, so imagine plants that grow much deeper and fuller roots that hold in the soils. Or even really simple things like your hedgerow example of just applying basalt dust that naturally comes out of basalt mining processes to ag land as a negative priming agent that again sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so we're really excited to get to a place where farmers who are carbon farming are sequestering huge amounts of carbon every year into their soil and getting paid for that.
Steve?
Well, it's just exciting hearing all these new technologies that are coming out. On the dairy side of it, when you look at manure, what is manure? It's an organic fertilizer, right? It's used to no better source. And when there was challenges with commercial fertilizer with nitrogen and the high price around the world, what a better source. And so I know there's technologies coming to help make that more efficient and maybe pelletize it or get it out to the markets. And so it's organic, it's natural, and that water technology. But a lot of farmers are looking, what can I do next, right? We finished our digester, we're okay, what's the next phase? We're looking at some extra biogas to produce hydrogen transportation fuel, or looking at a company that's into hydroponics and growing dairy feed indoors, with 5% of the water. So all this stuff it's exciting. 5-10 years from now, who knows where we'll be.
And we're bearing the lead here a little bit on the partnerships question I asked a minute ago with you, Steve, because you have a partnership with BMW, right? Mm-hmm. And so how does a dairy farm get a partnership with BMW? What's in it for you and what's in it for them?
Well, they're the ones that have partnered to buy the LCFS credits from the project. And it's encouraging because here's a car company that sees a neat story, right? They're looking at something that they see as positive, right, for their customers. Here we're taking cow manure and we're creating energy and reducing methane. We're doing something good with it. So it's a company that's outside of the ag that sees the benefits and thinks, wow, what a neat story, from poop to power.
Beth, what's exciting out there in the
How am I supposed
space?
To follow poop to power? But I will try. I spend my day, being talked to about blockchain. That is not my area of expertise, but I do work at a blockchain company. And I also spend my day, just mired in pages and pages of GHG global standards. So my example is actually an analog example. There was a Clean Up the Harbor initiative in Baltimore that started a couple years ago, and just a guy out on a walk was looking at the harbor filled with trash and came up with the idea to invent basically a machine they call Mr. Trash Wheel. And essentially it's powered by solar and water wheels, and it just removes trash from the harbor and puts it on a conveyor belt into the trash can. And it can remove up to, I think, 19 tons of trash a day. It just reminds me that not every problem needs a complicated solution, and that people are generally awesome. So I like to remember that as I'm up to my eyeballs in hashtags and blockchain.
I love it. Paul, we'll end with you.
So we're pretty focused on methane reduction. Between enteric methane and manure methane, it makes up like 70% of the footprint of any farm. And there's a ton of innovation taking place, and rightly so, because methane burns like 80% hotter than carbon. If we can move the needle on methane, it'll move the needle on climate change in the short term.
Yeah.
So you can get a real payback on that investment. If we can find ways to fund the kind of innovation that we've been talking about this morning, there's so much that's taking place in the form of direct measure, interventions, feed additives. I mean, just things that we haven't even occurred to us today are going to be in the fields over the next couple of years, as long as we have effective funding mechanisms to make those dreams a reality. I mean, that's really what's exciting to me is business can solve a lot of these problems because we're smart about allocating resources, and we can get things done. I think EDF, this is the way they've conducted their business from day one. How do we find quick answers to solve these problems that are realistic, fund those things that move the needle quickest? And I have confidence in this industry that we can solve these problems.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for being with me today, and let's have a round of applause for our panelists, please. All right, thanks.